Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and I am again without Michelle or Jimmy, but I luckily have my friends Lee O'Brien, hi Lee.
Hello Stephanie.
And Geoff Payne.
Hello Stephanie.
Here to talk to me today, and the reason I brought them in is because as 18th and 19th century specialists respectively, Geoff being 18th, Lee being 19th, we all are interested in George Eliot. So let's talk about George Eliot, shall we?
Gorgeous George.
Why should we still read George Eliot?
Why should we still read George Eliot? Well,
because she's good.
Because she's amazing. Why do I still read it? I love, of all her novels, I guess I love Middlemarch the most.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it's that Middlemarch, a story of provincial life. It's that sense she gives of this vast canvas of this particular world that she's showing us. And so there's the characters, there's the complexity behind it, ideas of reform and change and what people are capable of, and she sort of registers all kinds of cultural anxieties about changing roles, changing class things. So I think she to me she has a very humane intelligence. She develops the Jane Austen thing of caring about families and women, and the way life can be made livable and sort of bearable for ordinary people who can be in a lot of trouble just dealing with the social structures they're born into, which aren't just and aren't fair and often conspire to hurt people. So she has that idea that I think is fundamental to the romance plot, the idea of the rescue into love, but she complicates that enormously and she shows the failure of that. A lot of my students don't like George Eliot. Some of them love. One came up a couple of years ago and she said, reading Middlemarch changed my life, and I nearly hugged her. I thought, oh, this is what I want to hear. Some of them don't. Oh, shush.
Well, there is that
Who asked you?
There is that Rebecca Mead book, My Life with Middlemarch, which is about like her life of reading and rereading Middlemarch. So when it affects you, it really affects you. It really
does. Yeah. And the sticking point is Dorothea. Modern readers, I think, have a lot of problems with Dorothea, but then again, so did 19th century readers. So look, I don't know. I think she's humane. She's complex. She's a fantastic writer. I just love her prose. So that's me.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you've touched on like a lot of the things that I think are crucial in the reasons behind why we still read Eliot. But that idea that you mentioned about complexity, she's such a clever writer, and she takes ordinary life as she sees it. You know, this is the supposedly the time of the high Victorian realism, right? This is what we're interested in. We're interested in ordinary life. And she takes ordinary life seriously, but not dully. Like it's fun at the same time as it's serious. And she presents us with characters who are so complex. They are at the one and the same time heroes and heroines, but at the same time they're absolutely not. Every character is not just doubled, but they're tripled and quadrupled. There are so many different layers of it. It's real, but it's also ideal, but the ideal is undercut by the real, and the real is undercut by the ideal. There's so much layering and complexity in there that you can, it's one of those texts that you can, I'm talking about Middlemarch here in particular, one of those texts that you can just continually return to again and again, and each time you return to it, something new leaps out at you and draws you in. And there's such a cleverness behind it, and it's so artful, but at the same time seems so natural. It's so well plotted,
and she can be very funny too.
Well, that's the thing, So she takes it serious. She takes the story and the subject seriously, but there are some very funny bits and very funny characters in it.
Exactly.
Mr. Featherstone's treatment of all of his friends and relations, it's like Miss Havisham's relations in Great Expectations, without as much of the hyperbole, but still with as much comic effect.
Yeah, and Fred Vinci,
Yeah.
bumbling around trying to find life, making life meaningful, trying to find work, trying to make Mary love him, and he does silly things and says silly things, and I think well, that's a lovely description of it. Why do you like her?
For all of the reasons that you've already touched on, but what really strikes me is what Geoff said, where you can go back to her and reread her and find different things. Like I find her novels so rich in that, and I find that they shift with, and I suppose this is true of all novels, but I find it especially so with her. They shift as you age. What you find in them is so kind of, when I first read Middlemarch, I was, interested in Dorothea and, in a kind of single-minded way, and everything else was just a distraction. But now I'm finding, as I, I'm older and rereading it, it's not Dorothea, it's everybody else that is kind of more engaging to me. Not that I'm not interested in her, but it changes and it deepens. And I think you're right, she's so complex, and she creates such a beautiful vision of the world. Like, this is a world. It's not just a group of people in the world.
That's right,
She creates this vision of a whole kind of social kind of
and she makes
area.
you believe it.
And she makes you believe it. Yeah. I mean, it's like reading history, but it's fun. It's like just reading like this history of this like high Victorian moment, but in a kind of story way.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's the realist trick, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
If a realist novel is really good at what they do, you feel as if you've got the world there.
Yeah, and you understand it.
You believe in the world.
Yeah.
You believe in the
you
art.
play the game willingly.
And then you believe in all the ways in which it's connected and not connected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, see, she's famous for this particular web, that sense of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
Where everything, if you track everything in Middlemarch, everything actually is connected to everything else. And it's not sort of overwhelmingly obvious when you first read it, but when you go back to it, you see all of it's connected, either thematically or actually in terms of the plot.
And the interconnectedness is fundamental, but it's also rubbing up against the pretensions of society. So society's illusions that they're not connected, that there are these different gender or class distinctions which thoroughly separate people. And so they act as though they're not all connected. And yet they can't help but be connected. And there's that tension that she exploits so beautifully.
Or even worse than that, they create fictions of connectedness, self-serving fictions of connectedness.
Yeah.
Yes, and she's sort of actually trying to get through that and make us understand more meaningful connections, cross-class, cross-gender.
I'm interested in what you said about Dorothea and your students and other people, I suppose, relating to her. What is it about Dorothea in Middlemarch that's so problematic?
They get enraged with her because
she marries
the old scholar. and they Casaubon, why can't she just see that this is all wrong?
This is a disaster
this is
from the beginning.
Stupid thing. And they think, well, she fails because she did something damn stupid, and they don't take on what you have to take on, I think, to feel for her is all the multiple ways in which she's positioned to make this stupid mistake. Yes, it's a personal error, and I think that's brought out brilliantly with Celia's reaction to Casaubon. She really Dodo, can't you? He eats his soup or scrapes his, and he's got moles on his
you need a friend like that.
And Celia's got this real sexual disgust of what she sees. She sees him as a mean old man, but she's got this feeling that he's sexually not right for Dorothea in a way that poor Dorothea can't see. And students just get fed up with that. And if you don't at some level see that there's a real tragedy in what she's doing, if you don't feel compassion for her, the novel does tend to fall apart a bit.
Yeah.
And that's where because you just think, well, she's cooking the book, she's making a problem of something that wasn't there. And that was what a lot of reviewers said. They said it's no good blaming gender inequity. It's, the stupid woman made the wrong mistake and everybody knew it was wrong except her. So what's the matter with you? There's nothing wrong with the position.
You can't whinge now.
No, you can't whinge because it's all your fault.
Yeah.
So they're actually in a great tradition of not liking this aspect of people who didn't like Dorothea.
But how do you react to Dorothea? Differently from that, I assume.
Yes, yeah. I've always loved her, but because of her imperfections. Because I think we're shown that right from the beginning, the scene where they divide the jewels up.
Yes.
And she's so unaware of what she's doing.
And yet she has the capacity to recognise her error.
Yes.
And even in that first chapter, so, it begins with her trying to console Celia because she recognises that she has hurt her and offended her, and that she was in the wrong.
She was wrong.
And the narrator tells us that she acknowledges that she was in the wrong.
She's wrong.
And so she has that humane capacity. I mean, she is utterly human. This is what for me makes all of the characters. Everybody makes stupid mistakes. Everybody in the novel,
they do. That's so true.
Does stupid things, and some of them can't be recovered from. I mean, Mr. Featherstone realizes at the end he's made a stupid mistake.
Too late.
But too late.
Too late,
he can't rectify it.
Yes, but I love that point. Most of the characters do stupid things.
And that is to be human. To err is human.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I suppose, a kind of more interesting definition of realism than the definition of realism where it's like, we have to be kind of specific about, where we are and what the tablecloths look like and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That is real realism because it's real to human experience.
Well, that's right. It's that accurate portrayal of human nature and the human character. And not being afraid, for me, the cleverness of it is that, Dorothea is set up as a stereotype. And she never really stops being the stereotype, but she's much more than the stereotype. So the stereotype operates. She is St. Teresa, the modern day St. Teresa, but she's a St. Teresa who is, rather than getting a hagiography where she's perfect, we see all the flaws. We see the real human emerge from within that character.
Oh, she's short-sighted. Liable to tread in what is it? Liable to tread in the wrong places on the way to the New Jerusalem. But she's short-sighted. She can't see it. So it's actually factored into her physicality as a character.
And she's a dodo.
Yes, she's a dodo. Yes, which is that's never commented on. But that nickname and what it might mean to the readers.
Well, since we talked about Dorothea, maybe we should talk about Will Ladislaw.
Yes, Will Ladislaw.
So you've indicated Lee. Sorry?
Shiftless.
Well, you've indicated Lee to me that critics and readers are very divided about him.
Yes, he's always had a bit of a bad press. A lot of the initial reviewers didn't like him. They saw him as flighty. And
Henry James hated him.
Henry James.
Henry James
a lot of
Eliot.
Southern right.
Henry James hated a lot of things, I feel.
Don't mention the war. People saw him. We were having a conversation earlier about effeminate males in a certain other writer. But people saw him as too effeminate and flighty and light to be the hero. And someone, oddly enough, considering people had very mixed feelings about Dorothea, not good enough for Dorothea. And we
don't like her, but we want someone damn good for her.
We want someone better for her.
Yeah.
And so, I've always loved him as a character.
I've always loved him too. I kind of see him as like an archetypal romantic figure.
Oh, so do I. So you're there's only one male in the room. So now
we'll consult the male.
Tell us, what do you...
we brought in a token bloke for this.
You represent the blokes of the world. What is
I'm hardly representative.
Much more enlightened than most,
You are the representative bloke.
I have mixed feelings about him, but I have mixed feelings about all the characters. And I think I like him less than I like Fred Vincy, and I like him less than I like Ludgate. But that's not to say that I don't like him. And I think that artistically, at least, he is the perfect foil for Dorothea. Because of the fact that he remains to the end relatively undetermined. He continues to be a character who doesn't stabilise, settle into one thing.
That's very
and
interesting.
has the capacity for change.
Yes.
And so, because Dorothea is the type, she's the stereotype who has a tendency to become very set, very fixed, very short-sighted, can't see beyond the immediate. And I think that he offers the perfect foil to that because of the fluidity. Because of the fact that he has that farsightedness that continually keeps him looking over the horizon for other things.
And that's satirised as well.
Yes. Well, I mean, but as is everything.
He's so far-sighted that he can't
And he
actually
can't
get
see
down
what's
and
in
do
front of him.
anything.
Yeah.
But Dorothy's got the practicality.
Yeah.
She can get in and do the
And
stuff,
doing
and
the
he has
cottages
the
and
vision.
everything.
Well,
So in a way, I've taught this text a number of times, and a lot of the time people see the marriage with Will as being a real subversion of Dorothea's growing independence and potency in the world. All of a sudden she subjugates herself to another man, who is another type of Casaubon. Like, he is a man of ideas, he's a man of visions, of unrealised great works, and she's devoting herself to his service.
And he becomes a politician.
He becomes a politician.
And so she's just exchanged one for the other. Yeah.
The ultimate type in our modern world of shiftlessness and of shapelessness.
Yeah.
And
a lot of
but
fluidity.
fluidity. Will has, for me, it's he's a very romantic figure in terms of, we're thinking about romanticism and
attractive.
He's
when
young
we were
and
discussing him last week, Shelley came up as an idea of a type, the kind of Shelleyan type. He's got that radical political idealism.
Although Shelley would never become a politician.
No.
No, but at the same time, he was very interested.
He was very politically engaged.
He wouldn't have become a politician because being a poet for Shelley
was
more political than being a politician.
Yeah.
Right? Being a poet, you became legislator of the world. Okay.
Yeah.
So, becoming a politician would have been to blinker himself.
Yeah.
Imagination for Shelley is the key to bettering the human life, and so the role of the poet is to further the imagination. Ladislaw has a similar kind of a sensibility to him.
There's a European aspect of Ladislaw too that's interesting.
Well, Ladislaw is a Czech name, isn't it?
Yeah,
Slavic
I think
at least.
It's Polish, because they talk about him as being Polish.
Right.
So he has that, and when we first see him, he's in Rome with Naumann, the painter. And he clearly has a sense of Europe as a place of potential and a place of being someone other than he might be at home. And it's interesting that when Will and Dorothea first meet, it's on that disastrous wedding journey to Rome with Casaubon, and she realises the horror, the terrible mistake that she's made, and the fact that she can never get out of it. And Will is, I think, one of the things I like about him. He's so perceptive. As soon as he sees her, he realises that she's been crying, although she hides it all. And the way she's speaking about the marriage, he drops his hat. He almost can't speak when she's just revealing inadvertently the horror of this wedding journey where Casaubon is spending all the time in the Vatican library. And so
what everyone wishes their husband would do on their honeymoon.
Of course, doing research in the Vatican Library. What else would you do on a honeymoon? And he's embedded sort of in that European setting. But Naumann is very satirical about Will. And so Naumann is undermining his pretensions. So it's interesting that she's bringing, because it's Middlemarch, the study of provincial life. And what Will brushes up against in Europe is completely inimical to the sort of blinkered nature of life in the provinces in England. So, but then he's drawn back into provincial life. Although when they marry, they obviously move away and live in London, and he doesn't get neither. Both of them escape Middlemarch.
Yes.
But in a different kind. They don't change Middlemarch. Middlemarch is the same when they leave it. They haven't been able to do anything, which is what Dorothea wanted to do. She wanted to make change at home in the people that she knew and grew up with, and that's a failure. She can't do that.
Well, see, that's what I think is so interesting about Eliot, because I remember reading this as a fairly young person. I was probably at school, 16 or something. And
did you?
yeah, and I read it as a real love story between Dorothea and Will, and just kind of ignored all of the satirical, as you say, that his pretensions are kind of satirized, and there's much more complexity going on there in that relationship.
Yeah.
And so when I go back to it now, I think, how precisely did I read this as this grand romance? But I read it as like an almost like a Jane Eyre or a Pride and Prejudice, where they were these thwarted lovers, and I just kind of ignored the real kind of, as you say, complexity of that relationship and how like his political aspirations play out. That I don't know, I just didn't see as a young person.
That's interesting. I read it, I was a bit older. I read it at university, so I would very early 20s, but still not in my teens.
Yeah.
But I had the same response as you did. It was the working out of the romance.
Yeah, it was like a tragic romance, but it
you wanted them to come together.
Yeah, and I was just waiting for the whole bloody 800 pages for them to come together, you know. It was like, hurry up, get to it.
What are all these other characters doing?
Yeah. Why are we talking about doctors and all of this sort of stuff?
Right. Yeah.
It's funny how the book changes.
It's the power, yes, but isn't that right when you come back to it? Because I've lost track of the amount of times I've read it. I love it so much, and when I read it, the sentences almost come to meet me, you know, as I'm reading it. But what you say is so true. As you get older, as you do more reading yourself, the novel changes. It's not a stable thing, is it?
And now I think like you were saying, Geoff, before, you know, she has just substituted one husband for another who's pretty much not the same, but broadly similar.
That's scary.
Yeah.
But as I said earlier on as well, one of the things is that if you think about it hard enough, you can almost read every character in the book as a double for every other character.
Yeah, that's right.
True.
There is such like complexity in the way that she sets up all of the characters that, you know, it's difficult to find a way in which the characters don't duplicate any other character at some point in the narrative, at the same time as being independent of them and different, and the way in which I suppose they're determined. So you know, it kind of, you know, emphasizes that connectedness of the basic human nature of the human character, and so then whatever differences emerge become differences of choice or of context or of positioning, responses to, you know, social phenomena around them, rather than necessarily something that's ingrained and instinctive in the human character. There's so much commonality amongst all of the characters that, you know, it is easy to see, you know, Ladislaw as the double of Casaubon, but he is also the double of Ludgate. He's also the double of Fred Vincy. He's also, you know, there are so many potentials for how he's, and so he acts as a kind of a double of Dorothea as well. You know, in that way that
because you can cross the gender lines.
Well, even like the far-sighted, short-sighted kind of, you know, he's the far-sighted one. She's literally short-sighted. You know, there's a nice kind of, you know, contrast that's thrown out there.
A friend of mine who's an historian, Ruth Richardson, writes wonderful stuff, and she's a Dickens expert, but she's doing work on Nightingale, Florence Nightingale. And Nightingale said something really fascinating about Middlemarch. Ruth sent me this little paragraph where Florence Nightingale found the ending frustrating, and just picked up those connections that you're making, that she goes from one man to another, and she uses a word, and I just can't think of what the word is. It's a word for a leprechaun, clarion or something, and she describes Will in that way. And this little leprechaun is the one who gets into the rich man's cellar and drinks his wine, and he doesn't like work. And Florence Nightingale says, why the hell, she doesn't say it in exactly these words, but why the hell does George Eliot make Dorothea marry? Why is the resolution of all her problems yet another marriage? Nightingale says we're crying out for women
But
to
see,
go
I think
into the
that
professions and
there's a
work.
mistake in reading it as a resolution to all her problems, because I don't think that Eliot sees there being a resolution to all her problems.
No, I might be misrepresenting.
But I think that's the way
resolution
people
of the
often
plot.
do. That's
Yeah.
the way people often do read it.
Yeah.
You know, the resolution
Yeah.
of the novel
Yeah.
Is the resolution.
a romantic ending or a
Yeah.
comedic ending, at least,
Yes.
where the problems are
It's-
overcome and everything
Yes.
is resolved and
Yes.
people
Yes.
go on and live happily ever after. And I don't think Eliot allows us
No,
that kind of idealism.
No, but I think Nightingale was saying, why don't we, if we avoid the word resolution, why isn't the end of the novel where Dorothea becomes an independent woman on her own and seeks some kind of... She's independently wealthy. There's nothing stopping Dorothea going to London and helping Florence Nightingale, if you'll allow her to move out of the...
Allow her to move out of the fictional world.
Across history and out of history into the real world. But that's what I think... Nightingale was getting upset that pattern of fulfilment for women, as problematic as it is still being presented as through marriage. It's a romance plot. And
well, I think that's something that Victorian fiction
Yeah.
really doesn't solve that, because even if you get to, Lee and I have been working on New Women fiction, and New Women fiction is all about, women getting out into professions and becoming professional writers or photographers or, opening up shops and all of this. It still ends mostly with marriage. So it's not a, I mean, I kind of feel like I understand where Florence Nightingale is coming with that critique, and I also kind of increasingly kind of share that perspective, but I also think it's something that she can't solve by herself.
No.
And I think, part of with the agenda of the novel to be an accurate depiction of provincial life, the pressures on Dorothy, so, yes, she has the potential to be independent.
Yes.
But the social pressures upon her remain to within the broader social picture. The role of the woman is to bear children,
and support her
husband. And Eliot, is aware that there are other options.
Yes.
But
her own life manifests that.
Her own life manifests that. But she's also aware of the pressures on the real or the imagined individual in this provincial world.
What does Virginia Woolf say? George Eliot is the only novelist for grown-up people, and she's stuck to the hard facts. And I'm sure she was talking about this Dorothea.
Right, and so, the idea of Dorothea going off and becoming the independent woman is an idealised vision that Eliot can't allow to stand.
And that's a fantasy, isn't it?
It's a fantasy, right. It's a fantasy, it's an ideal.
It's a fantasy as much as the romantic ending is a fantasy.
Yes.
But as you're saying, George Eliot in her own life wasn't. She came out of Middlemarch. She's triumphantly left it and became this amazing writer. So and
had a very unconventional sexual life as well.
She was a fallen woman as well as the sage and the great writer.
Yeah.
So and lots of other women did it. Lots of other women weren't destroyed by the Middlemarch social frameworks and limitations. But I'm with Geoff. I think it's a more upsetting novel and a novel that's more likely to make you want to change things if you see Dorothea as partly terribly destroyed by what she's had to grow up with and what she's had to. She's dealt a rotten hand, and she actually can't win.
Well, and all of those, the central couples. So Ludgate and Rosamund, Fred and Mary, Dorothea and Will.
Yes.
Like, it's not a happy ending really for any of them.
No.
Right?
No. Can I ask you too about Ludgate? Because I think I started when I used to read it, like you, I thought about Dorothea, but the more I read it now, the more I get intrigued by Ludgate.
Yeah.
So what?
I think the first time I read it, it was more a book about Ludgate for me than it was about Dorothea.
See, the bloke speaks.
But now I'm feeling that too. Now I read it, and like you, I'm coming around. Like my first reading, I thought Ludgate was kind of a distraction.
Well, more recently, I've been far more fascinated by Mr. Fairbrother than I have by Ludgate, because he's got the really tragic kind of heroic action, where he puts himself out of the picture in order to promote Fred's romance with Mary.
Yes.
And he doesn't have to.
He doesn't have to. No, that's true. But I think it's fascinating that see the difference between male and female readers. When you first read it, it was a story about Ludgate.
But I have to admit, I read it under sufferance. It was Lee was my tutor as an undergraduate some years
the
ago.
secrets are coming out. Mask the microphone, Richard.
And let's say I didn't quite finish it the first time around.
So Lee was a tutor of Geoff, and Geoff was a tutor of me. So it's come full circle.
And the problem was time, of course.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I wasn't enjoying it; it was just time.
Yes, Geoff.
But
Yes.
So reading it in that way, and I was reading it fast, and I was reading it
Yes.
without the ability to really kind of engage in the splendid
all these things that
complexity of it.
Yeah.
I was trying to latch onto some things that I could write about in my essay,
or some witty bon mots for your tutorial, perhaps.
That's right. Well, actually, mainly to get through the comprehension tests that we had. We used to get given these passages.
No,
it wasn't.
I inherited them. I had to admit it. Oh, really? I wish you wouldn't rake up the past. But no, I think it's. But what? Because I think he's a fascinating character, and I think we were going to talk about some of the things we don't like about George Eliot, and I think Ludgate's fate is so cruel.
Yeah.
It really tears me to bits. I'm much more upset about what happens to Ludgate than I am to Dorothea, because at least Dorothea falls in love.
Yeah.
They're sexually attracted. She is going to have a happy life, even though it's not, the best of all possible worlds type life. But Ludgate is utterly, utterly destroyed.
Well, somebody said to me once in relation to George Eliot's heroines that she doesn't allow her heroines the liberties that she herself took in life, and that was what annoyed her about Eliot. But I kind of feel like she does that to the men as well. Like, she doesn't really let anybody off the hook. No, it's not just her heroines. I mean, I kind of agree and disagree with that, but I think with Ludgate you can see her not letting anybody off the hook. There's no happy endings.
And it's his sexual desire. It's this fatality of the desire he feels for Rosamund. He cannot. It destroys him, and she's a fascinating. This perfectly feminine woman who is lethal, who is absolutely unstoppable. She's a torpedo. She cannot be stopped, and she just. It's just awful. The destruction of him, and all the best impulses to save the world and go and be a doctor in the poor parts of town and help real people. He becomes an expert in gout, and the horror of
a very debilitating illness. I might say.
Yes, and it's a disease of the rich.
The rich, that's right. The Henry VIII disease.
So in the eyes of the world, he's a success. In his own eyes, he's a terrible failure, and it kills him because he dies when he's only 50. Yeah. And I think, oh, George Eliot, why did you do that to such a nice?
But this is what the novel does. They all make stupid mistakes, and usually he can never recover from it. Yeah. Dorothea maybe recovers, but then she makes the mistake again.
Yes.
Depending on how you read the mistake.
Depending on how you read it. And I agree, probably, we seem to be set up to believe that she's going to have a happy life with Will, even if it's not an unproblematic life.
Yes. Well, being sexually attracted to the person you're married to is not a mean.
It's a good start. It's more than she had the first time around, so we're getting there.
So that aspect of it is fine. Yeah, but I think that I just, and what worries me a bit. See, there's that whole line of argument about George Eliot, and it's been part of feminist criticism for a long while, that she insists with these very complicated deterministic worlds where everything is connected with everything else, that there are kind of ironclad consequences for every act, and you cannot escape that, and that's the moral vision of the novel. You have to be careful what you do, because you can't, what's done cannot be undone, blah blah blah. And I think, but Carol Christ wrote this fascinating journal article. It's in the 1970s, called Aggression and Providential Death in George Eliot's Fiction. And Christ argues that George Eliot cheats, that she insists that Dorothea has made this terrible mistake, and that she has no other option but to stay with the marriage. And Casaubon gets to the point where he's saying to her, even when I'm dead, you've got to complete the key to all mythologies, which will take her the rest of her life.
Yeah.
What happens? At the very instant where she is to promise that she will do that, he dies.
Yeah.
And Carol Chris says, oh, come on.
It's very convenient.
You know, geez,
let's kill off the odd
So
dude.
why didn't George Eliot follow through the implications for her own views, which is some mistakes that we make cannot be undone, and we must be forced to live with the consequences of them. Therefore, Casaubon stays alive. He's only in his early 40s. He could have lived for another 20 years, and her life is with him forever.
Well, I mean, God, can you imagine how dreary and terrible the novel is?
It would have
if she
destroyed
stayed alive
her and made her utterly miserable. But if you're saying, well, it was her choice, but she doesn't cook the books for Ludgate. See, remember that scene in The Green Dragon where he's playing billiards with Fred Vincy, and Fred comes in and sees that Ludgate is trying to play for money. And Fred, it's a wonderfully observed scene, Fred sort of just touches him or nudges his elbow and says, and he breaks Ludgate out of the trance Ludgate is in as he's trying to win money at billiards. And I always think, well, you know, if Ludgate had won the lottery or something,
he would have been very useful.
It would have been fine, but she's never going to let that happen. And people did win lotteries in real life, you know. She doesn't. It has always bothered me that some characters she will let off the hook.
Well, Fred gets let off the hook.
Yeah.
Like Fred gets pretty much everything.
Yeah, he gets
wants.
everything. Yeah,
that he needs anyway.
Yeah,
I mean, but of course, you know, his getting what he needs comes with his ability to recognise his need to transform or change, or being brought up into the obviousness of the delusory life that he's been living in, where he's going to be Mr. Featherstone and live in the grand estate at Stonecourt. And instead, he has to work, and he has to.
All right. Yeah, that's right.
So you know, he gets away
he does.
with it.
He does.
But at the same time, he also has to live with the consequences.
Yeah.
And I think you know, everybody gets away with it, but has to live with the consequences at the same time. Whatever happiness there is, it's and see, part of Ludgate's tragedy is that he's not really ever able to live with the consequences, and hence he dies.
And she never let the author.
And see, Casaubon has to die because he can't change either.
No,
he's an already dead character when Dorothy marries him. He's a
but as husband, he has absolute power.
Yeah.
And
I mean, there's an interesting connection because it's, you know, set during the time of the Reform Bill as well, and there's all of that. There's all of that idea which is debated from the time of the French Revolution on about the. Tom Payne writes about the inheritance and the idea of one generation being able to impose their ideas about what's right onto the next generation as being one of the greatest crimes of human history. That it's a form of trying to own the future, and it's a haunting. He has this whole Gothic spectral imagery involved in it, and
how fascinating.
You know, that's exactly the, you know, so you know, the Reform Bill is is in a way an attempt to put aside that past the Gothic architecture of the English Constitution, put it aside and bring in a new future.
But at the same,
Casaubon is that relic of the past. He is the relic,
and so he must.
And he's also the haunting figure. He is the leash.
And while he's alive, there is no change possible.
And he tries to manage things even beyond his actual physical death, and he's unable to.
That's unable to exercise context to put it in, and the Gothic haunting.
And the haunting. Well, what's interesting too is that the work that I've done on like women writing about the French Revolution and Reform is that they look to the Magna Carta a lot as a kind of like, and this is a common kind of thing in late 18th century writing is. The Magna Carta shows that it's in the DNA of the British to reform peacefully. Right? That peaceful reform, or at least gradual reform, of the kind that the Magna Carta kind of instituted, even though legislative change is an inheritance of the British, and is why the British Constitution is so kind of strong, because they have shown a capacity to reform without cutting the king's head off. Although they did cut the king's head off, but we'll just forget about that. Yeah. So we'll just forget about the 17th century and move quickly along. So there's an interesting connection there too about that idea of reform and what reform means in the British context, which is something that you wanted to talk about, Lee, in relation to the politics of the novel.
Well, see, I think I think George Eliot in Middlemarch humanizes politics. I think you've both put it in fascinating historical context. I'm going to sort of bring it back a little bit to that more familial context and that idea that the goodness, it's away from the whole idea of legislative reform and more that away from the idea of big R reform into little R reform, coming through the decency of people with each other. That people, it's the rescue into love thing, if you're putting it into heterosexual romance terms. But the idea that I think is central to all George Eliot's novels, that at that micro level, you can make things better by making things better just here and now with your nearest and dearest. That's not as an interesting a point as that you two are making.
I think that it's a very true thing as well. I mean, Mr. Brooke, who runs for Parliament on the reforming platform, is humiliated.
He's pelted with rotten eggs. That's right.
That kind of grand political reform is at least satirized.
Yes.
It's not that it's cast as being unworthy or a bad idea, but certainly the kinds of people who go into it and the reasons that they go into it and
already
what have you.
It's a degraded thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
From the motives,
and so it does, it does take a far greater interest in the personal, a bit, the way in which an individual can do things to their own life, and to their own thinking and character, which has a grand effect. So, all Dorothea's plans for Middlemarch are also, essentially come to nothing. And yet, the things that she does in her personal life, her ability to. So Will first of all breaks away from the benefactor, the beneficiary of Casaubon, and then Dorothea does the same. They cast that aside, the inheritance, and we all know how strong a thing that idea of inheritance and property and inherited wealth is for the social milieu of the time and the way in which fiction renders the social milieu of the time, and so they're putting aside that inherited past in that very personal way, and then building themselves a space where they can do something a little bit different, and that is the radical thing.
Yes, and it's the radicalism of that Eliot, I think, sees as more enduring. She sees that as genuine change.
Yes.
Remember, there's that lovely exchange. I think it's with Caleb Garth. It's either with his wife or with Fred, and he says, "I don't know why people go into politics. I can't stand seeing mismanagement over 1 acre of land, let alone watching it unfold over the whole country. I can't do that. I will take care of my 1 acre of land." And I think if you're looking for a moral centre of the novel, Caleb Garth might be it, although I find it irritating. But I think that
well, see, again, he's one of the less real characters.
Well, he is.
He's such an idealised figure.
He is.
And therefore he's irritating.
Yes, he's not alive in the way that.
But especially too because it's a book full of such kind of complex characters. When somebody isn't, it's just
it jars.
It jars.
Yes, I think the whole.
He does lend money to Fred.
Yeah, I think the whole Mrs. Garth annoys the living daylights out of me, although the narrator just loves her and keeps saying how good I think she's a tyrannical.
You don't think there's anything tongue-in-cheek about?
No.
Well, I was going to ask you about the intrusive narrator too, so that's a nice kind of segue.
Okay, the intrusive narrator.
What do you make of this intrusive narrator?
Look, until I think when I first read the novels, I just sort of took the narrator on trust. But it's the feminist analysis that separated. It started with Sandra Gilbert and Goodbar in The Mad Woman in the Attic, saying that there's a feminist author behind the male narrator in George Eliot's fiction. And so they set up that capacity to separate out the narrative voice from George Eliot as author, and to take the whole George Eliot thing and see the narrator as a separate entity. And I get, because I do a lot of close readings of the novels, I've started to pick up the multiplicity of instances where what the narrator says is happening and what it means is not what it's actually meaning in the plotting and the way the novel is actually unfolding. So I think I've been able to deal with the intrusiveness of the narrator much better since I've understood the narrator as a very flawed voice.
Not an authority.
Not a position of authority at all, which it seems to be, but actually compromised, and just almost as compromised as any of the characters in the fiction. Now, whether George Eliot herself would have liked that reading of it, I don't know, but that's the way I cope with the intrusive narrator.
But I think you're right that when you first read the novel, at least when I first read the novel, I didn't think much of it.
No, I didn't either.
You just take it on.
I didn't even think of it as intrusive, I don't think. I actually quite liked it. A lot of students don't. This is why I mentioned it. A lot of students get really enraged by it. And I found that I could teach the novel in a better way if I said to the students, look, don't take the narrator on trust. Start looking at what's happening in the novel and what the narrator is saying is happening, and you'll see that it's not the same. So therefore, you don't have to take this sometimes rather bullying tone of the narrator. And I just think it makes the fictions more interesting. So what about you?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I also don't particularly think that I've ever found the narrator to be particularly intrusive. But I also, I think as literary critics, we have been trained to never take a narrator's voice on trust.
We're constantly poised to distrust everyone.
We are.
Well, to ask questions.
Yeah. No, I'm just kidding.
But essentially, to be skeptical. So
that's
somebody
right.
when the narrative voice is telling us something's happening, okay, is it really?
Is it?
Yeah.
Is that really what's going on? And so, for me, I think by the time I read Middlemarch properly, I was already thoroughly ingrained in that practice, and so I didn't have the problem of wondering whether I had to accept the narrator's voice as the ultimate authority, and so therefore read it as a character, and also being a Byronist, where DAnjou and the narrator is so brilliantly flawed, and so it is Byron and it isn't Byron, and it is authoritative and it's completely unauthoritative, and so approaching it in that kind of mindset where you read it through, you take what it says as being an articulation of a particular viewpoint, but it's not necessarily a viewpoint which is shared by the novel. And so you need to tease out what the novel is telling
what
us,
it's doing, what's happening
aside from what the narrative is.
So I'm interested too in the degree, and I've never been able to sort this out in my classes or in my own thinking of the novel, is whether the narrative voice is a male voice. Are we? Do we read it as George Eliot? Do we read it as male?
It's funny. I've always read it as male.
I've always read it as female.
Really?
Yeah. See, I think I have too.
But as female?
Yeah.
I think I initially read Middlemarch certainly as a male narrative voice. I don't know why. Not so much her other novels.
Yeah. Well, the narrative voice is different.
Well, I know, but I mean,
but
I haven't really kind of. I don't know. I just read the narrative voice of Middlemarch as male.
Performance aspect of it too, because at certain points she's definitely performing that idea of masculine authority through the narrative voice, but at other points I don't think she is.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So how much is she radicalising the idea of narrative authority?
Yeah, the narrative authority can come from a woman.
Can it come from a woman? And how do you configure that in the actual texture of the novel?
I mean,
itself?
Again, Eliot as a figure presents us with a complex problem about the real female who adopts the male pseudonym to write her fiction. How do we gender that? Right? It creates a gender problem, which is very. It remains really difficult to resolve, and we have this desire, I suppose, to determine a gender. I said that I read it as a female voice, but actually I think I really try not to read it as a gendered voice. I try to read it as a neutral voice.
Yes,
like an
that's interesting. A neutral narrative story. Well, there's that tradition of the storytelling voice is non-gendered. Is often non-gendered, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
although,
is it non-gendered or is it masculine?
Or is it implicitly
masculine?
It's implicitly masculine. The
Yeah.
non-gendered is implicitly masculine, but I don't think that it has to be that simple. I think that often it is, but I don't think it has to be.
No, I agree.
Well, I thought that we might wrap up our conversation by looking at George Eliot as like a cultural figure and what she means, especially because she has been the female writer who's retained the male pseudonym. You know, we don't call Charlotte Bronte Cara Bell, but we still call her George. Yeah. So what do you think she means now as a cultural figure, and what does she come to mean? I suppose.
I don't know. I don't know what. I mean, it's getting at modern reading practices, and I don't know the degree to which she doesn't have anything like the authority now that she had in her own time.
Yeah.
And I think she sort of got put on a pedestal in her own time, and this is what the modernists hated about her, and they sort of just really knocked her up and said she was a boring, dull Victorian, blah blah blah.
Well, the modernists, we can ignore them.
Yeah, we can ignore them. But no, they were very damaging.
They were very.
but she was sort of seen as this figure of this sage figure, and a lot of people who knew her at the time said that that's unfair. She was a much more interesting, more sceptical person than she was manufactured as being, but she sort of worked on that position of being the sage and all the rest of it. So look, as a cultural, is it George Levine who says he cannot think of anyone in the 19th century who can really survive a strictly intellectual comparison with George Eliot? He thinks as highly as that. I think it's George Levine, I hope I'm not misquoting him. He thinks she, as an intellect, she was just overwhelming in the 19th century. So, and I think that's true, and I think it's amazing that an intellect of that capacity was not a philosopher, wasn't a scientist, but she's actually creating fictions. And I think that, in some sense, is how she was received in her own time. And now, I just don't know, because I like her so much and because I read her, I don't know what kind of cultural currency she has in these days.
I think she's feared a little bit. I kind of think that she's got this reputation as this, intense intellect, and that she was the kind of very serious kind of, moral very, very kind of classic realist.
The way that people don't pick up on the humour, they tend to focus on other things and don't pick up on the humour of her. And I think that there is that, she carries with her this baggage of the intellectualism and of the seriousness of,
and therefore she's unapproachable.
And
that she's not readable. I remember a friend saying that she conspicuously displays Middlemarch on her bookshelf because it gives off a certain kind of aura of intellectualism. It just puts it there.
James Joyce. And
and you'll really scare everybody. But I think people think that she's not readable or approachable, or I think there's a certain kind of fear about reading her now.
And
I don't think she's not just
she's
properly
adapted
read
for TV far less than what say Austen or Bronte
Dickens.
or Dickens.
Yes, if you think of the Brontes,
and I think people think that putting her up against Dickens is going to be the kind of easier read, whereas I don't necessarily think that's the case.
That's true.
I mean, I find Dickens half great and half deadly dull. So that was
problematic.
So I think that people are scared.
He's funny.
He is funny. But I think people are scared of her. I don't know.
Interconnectedness is wonderful in Bleak House. But anyway,
maybe we have to have another Dickens.
We'll have to have another session. We'll bring some students in and put them on the
we can grill them about their opinions on Middlemarch.
Drag yourself away from Twitter and tell us what you think of Middlemarch.
Well, I kind of think that you have to read Middlemarch in order to get an English degree. think it's one of
What a
those
great
books.
idea.
Yeah, it's one of those books where I feel
yeah.
like you haven't kind of done it properly.
Yeah.
If you haven't read Middlemarch.
Absolutely. Stephanie's so right, isn't she? She's
Jeff is enigmatically smiling like he thinks that's a really terrible idea.
I'm not an absolutist.
Well, see, I like making absolute statements that can be later pulled apart.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely fabulous.
I think that's just about it now that we've degenerated into AbFab.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's all good. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Geoff.
Thanks, Steph.
That was a great conversation. This has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. We miss you, Jimmy and Michelle, but we're sure you'll be back soon. If you could rate and review us on iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated, as that really helps other listeners to find the show, and everyone should get to listen to our musings on George Eliot. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.